Greetings, my name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special as we discuss Asian and African American history, culture, commonalities, and concerns. And we're joined by two distinguished guests. To my far right is Dr. Bessie W. Blake. She is a professor and she's an author of 2 award-winning books. And to my right center is Joyce Moy. She is the executive director of the Asian American Asian Research Institute of CUNY. Welcome to Cultural Caravan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, in our first half hour, we really had a really robust conversation as relates to our collective histories, the commonalities, the struggles that our peoples have endured here in the U.S. Now we're going to move into, and we did talk about, as you know, the role of women, because I think it's so important that we talk to our struggle, but also how the impact of women in this struggle. And now as we move into the civil rights movement in the 60s and the struggles that we had for human rights and dignity. Bessie, talk to us about the role of women, African-American women in the civil rights movement.
Well, we had a really important leadership role. As a matter of fact, the women were the spark that got the movement started. You talked about, you know, the mother and our being mothers. I think the civil rights movement of the 60s and the 70s really started with the murder of Emmett Till and how Mamie Till responded and made it such a public affair that it just went to the heart of every African American, especially, but I think many people in the country. And I say African American because we had Jet magazine. We don't have that anymore, but that was the magazine that all the pictures were shown. So that kind of coincided with the culmination of the push for school desegregation. So all these things that like the 1954 Supreme Court decision, and you know the schools are going to be integrated across the country. So in 1955 there was the murder of Emmett Till, but also in the summer of 1955 there was a meeting in Tennessee, and Rosa Parks and another woman of the movement, Septima Clark, and she didn't like you to mispronounce her name, so I hope I'm getting it right. But anyway, they went to workshops on how to implement the the school desegregation court decision. And when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on that Montgomery, Alabama bus, it wasn't because her feet were tired. She had been in the struggle since 1943. She had joined the NAACP at a time when women did not join. And I think she was one of the first, maybe she was the second woman to join the NAACP there in Montgomery. She had gone several times to try to register to vote. She was the secretary to the NAACP. And so we get in the media, when they didn't report on it at the time, and I didn't know about it when I was in high school, but when they did start to report on the civil rights movement, they said, oh, the tired seamstress. But she was an activist, and you know, a long-time activist. She didn't get on the bus to be arrested. She was tired, but she was more tired of the conditions, and I think everything came together in 1955. And so there was a woman, Joanne Robinson, who was a school teacher, an educator, and she, the word got around about Mrs. Parks' arrest, so she, they mimeographed then the notices and sent it out with the children, to put it throughout the neighborhood. Don't take the buses, don't take the buses. So there were a number of women who had these leadership roles throughout the civil rights movement.
Yeah, it's simply amazing to hear about all this history. And of course, some of us have read about it, but we're not taught about this at all in school. And we're also not taught about the roles that some of the other communities played in the civil rights movement. You know, the experience of internment really galvanized many members of the Japanese American community. And they came out to support the civil rights movements, particularly the movements that were being put forth by the black community, because they understood the concept of oppression in a way that other Asian Americans even did not understand. They understood what it was like not just to be excluded, but to be demeaned and dehumanized.
And confined.
And never, you know, again, Asian Americans did not suffer the kinds of atrocities. There's nothing else you can call it except atrocities that the black community suffered. But yet, the empathy that arose from that experience was enough to propel fairly large numbers of Japanese Americans into the support of the civil rights movement. So Yuri Kochiyama is a name that you hear often associated with Malcolm X.
Yeah.
She was a supporter. Her family continues to be quite active in many ways. There was Grace Lee Boggs.
Yes.
And again, I think the commonalities, the empathy that came out of the kinds of experiences that we had in the United States is what drove all of those kinds of things.
Right.
Asia does not have a basic understanding of what has happened in the U.S. with respect to race. And as a result, they are often, I think, they fall victim to misunderstandings based on the narratives that have been given to them.
Yes.
And as you and I talk, it becomes clearer and clearer to me that we must be the voices that tell our own stories. We can't allow the other voices that will distort the story
take control of
and
it.
take control of the narrative.
Now, Joyce, as you know, there over the years, there's been a large influx of Asians from other parts of the world. In terms of their experience, like you said, their experiences, or maybe not actually understanding the history that's impacted people of color, one of the concerns is how do we ensure that everyone understands these struggles as relates to the collective pursuit of human rights for all. I just wanted to get your to tell us about some of the newer immigrants from Asia.
Sure.
In terms of,
Well, when the immigration law was changed in 1965, the quotas for countries changed. So it became less Western European dominated in terms of the inflow of immigrants. And then you began to see larger numbers of immigrants from other parts of Asia. That included the Indian population, the Korean population, and so on. Prior to that, the Chinese were being allowed into the country at the rate of 105 per year. The first time I ever met a Korean person was probably in 1970. So the law changed in 65. It took a number of years for the pipeline to fill, and these folks began to come over. But the Asian population, the Asian American population today is largely immigrant, and they do not have the historical perspective that some of the Asian communities who have been here longer have had. So I often emphasize to the newer immigrant communities how important it is to understand slavery, civil rights, Reconstruction in particular, and to really understand, I'm sorry, I meant the Civil War, to really understand the civil rights movement, because many of the things that impact us, both negatively and positively, have come out of this history that precedes these newer immigrants coming to the U.S. And without an understanding of that, they oftentimes can be, how shall I say, used as a tool to drive wedges between communities, to prevent communities from moving forward. They are oftentimes coming at an issue from a perspective that again does not take into consideration the racialized nature of the United States. And so it's important for them to understand that. And it's important for them to understand, too, that if they're going to fight for their own rights, they must fight for the rights of others. And it's something that can't be overcome unless this history is taught from the very, very beginning of their school careers. There are so many people in my generation even who've lived through the civil rights era who haven't heard the stories. I mean, the things that Bessie brought out, there are so many aspects of it that I, who consider myself a fairly well-read person, have not heard about.
Recently, we've had some issues, particularly as relates to police brutality. One in particular was the Akai Gurley tragedy that happened a couple of years ago, where you had an Asian American police officer, rookie, who unfortunately, tragically shot and killed Akai Gurley. And African Americans at that time did not understand the response from the Asian community, and felt that somehow that they, so I just wanted you briefly to clarify that for those who may need to understand the perspective of Asian Americans at that time in terms of their defense of Peter Leung, and certainly the understanding of our mutual pain in terms of police brutality and racism that has impacted our communities. I just wanted to bring that up.
So with respect to what happened with Peter Leung, it's fairly clear that this young man was in over his head. He was in a dark hallway. His gun was out of his holster, which my understanding is that violates police protocol. The gun went off, whether he pulled the trigger or whether due to fear the trigger was pulled. The bullet ricocheted off a wall and killed Akai Gurley. And what happened there was, of course, he was prosecuted. And the Asian American community, the Chinese community in particular, felt that this was unfair. They did not say that Akai Gurley attacked the officer in any way. They felt sympathetic to the family. They understood that this was a young man who had died in vain. Their frustration was with the fact that had Peter Leung been a white officer, he would not have been prosecuted. You heard the community talk over and over again about what happened to Eric Gardner. There you had a videotape where a policeman administered an illegal chokehold and killed the man. It was on video, and he wasn't prosecuted. And yet, because this officer was Asian, he was prosecuted. So the Asian community saw him as being a scapegoat. They were not denying that police brutality happens to the black community. They were not saying that Akai Gurley's family was not worthy of sympathy and should have been there should have been tremendous sympathy expressed. And there were a number of Asian American community organizations and residents who came out to support Akai Gurley's family's demand for justice. And so their protest, et cetera, wasn't aimed at the racial issue as far as the African American community was concerned. They were protesting the unequal application of justice, if you will, towards a Chinese police officer. So there was tremendous misunderstanding. People felt that because they supported Peter Leung, that they were in fact saying that black lives don't matter. And that's not what was really going on in that case.
Well, I think in addition to a feeling that black lives don't matter, within the black community, there was a feeling that that there has to be consistency, that because you know, you look at the white police officer who has someone in a chokehold, then that should be prosecuted according to the law. And if there is, you know, the gun out of the holster, whatever regulations were violated, that should be prosecuted according to the law. And there's a real thrust in the black community to have accountability. And the consistent thing there would be just whatever is just, let's do that. Let's get back to the principles of saying what's right in this situation. And I was mindful of the case in Maryland where there was 2 or 3, I think, black officers involved in this young man whose back was broken, and the black community didn't say, well, you know, he's black and you didn't prosecute those white officers. No, they went out in force and protested against those black officers. And so that's the kind of consistency I'm thinking about, and that was like the sentiment
Yeah, and I think
in the black community.
Yeah, and I think the Asian community, I would not have had the rage it had the white officer who was on videotape been prosecuted, and then if Peter Lang violated regulations, then they would have said, okay, we understand that. But it was because of the disparate application of prosecution that they were protesting that aspect of it, perhaps not clearly explaining what was going on there. I think that the rage was really driven by that disparate application of the law. And I would agree with you that anyone who takes a life without justification, where rules are violated particularly, needs to be prosecuted. I would agree with you on that.
Okay.
I'm just trying to help people understand what was actually driving the rage.
Yes.
And I appreciate that. I think both of you clearly expressed that. And certainly, I know right now we're in a very interesting time, too, where other issues, particularly as it relates to fairness and trying to equal the playing field, even as it relates to educational opportunities. And certainly right now, and certainly this has been an issue throughout, which is the question of ensuring that children get opportunities to go to specialized high schools or colleges and universities. And I know that the Asian community has been very concerned about whether changes or proposed changes will impact on the opportunities for children in the Asian community, as well as in the community, African-American community, because unfortunately we've seen that very few African-Americans and Latinos are admitted to certain specialized high schools, as well as other opportunities. So I think that one of the things that, and these are questions that are going to continue, and I just wanted you to briefly share with those who may be questioning or concerned about the position of the Asian families as relates to the concerns relating these tests and the changes that are coming.
So there seems to be some sort of innuendo that Asian Americans think that they own the classroom. I believe that was in fact, or own the seats. In fact, I believe those were the terms that the chancellor used. The problem here is as follows. All of our families, all of our parents want their children to get a quality education. It is clear that in New York City, large segments of the education system are failing. So we have a situation where the Asians are getting into the specialized high schools at fairly high rates at this point. I think I saw statistics that said 62% of these schools, the students are Asian. But the fact of the matter is they're getting into the schools not because they're privileged. 58.4% of Asians under the age of 18 live in poverty or near poverty. Their parents are sacrificing their own futures in order to pay for test preparation. This is not a privilege. This is not gaming the system. They are doing what they believe is important. There are many Asian parents that can't afford to do that, and they're not doing it. Just like in the other communities, the same kinds of things that are happening, either because there's no money or there's no time. People can't take on the additional burden of paying for their children to study for these exams. So the Asian community is particularly upset because what they are saying is that we have fought for every seat at every table, and now, because you don't like the results, you're going to take seats away from us. And again, it is not directed towards the African American or the Latino community. What they are saying is provide more seats, elevate the level of education throughout the entire city. You know, as a mother of two children, I did not want my children going to the specialized high schools. It would have meant that they had to get up at 5:30, be standing at the bus stop by 6:30 in order to get to class on time. I would have preferred that my children walk across the street to an excellent school in my neighborhood, but we know that's not the case. And then the other statistic that was cited that really got me upset was a statistic that said that 50% of these schools are fed by 4% of the middle schools, meaning that this is an elite group that gets in. There's only 4% of the middle schools in New York City that provide 50% of the students to these high schools. And I said to myself, well, why is it that the other 96% are not able to produce students that can get into these schools? So there is a larger issue. I think that it's important for us to expand the pie rather than taking pieces away from others, because again, Asians are not privileged. We didn't create this system.
I was just, as you were speaking, Joyce, thinking about the 1954 Supreme Court decision that we would integrate. We were trying to provide equal opportunity, equal education for all of America's children, but we were going to do it with all deliberate speed. And here we are now, well into this new millennium, and we still have the same problem. And we need a fix. Now, as I understand this, this proposed change at the specialized high schools, there would be an expansion. It wouldn't be an immediate. They're going to do that with all deliberate speed, and then it might not happen at all. But they would leave the test in place, but expand admission. Don't have a single criteria of admission. Expand that, and I think that's reasonable. Currently, there are 5% of students who go to specialized high schools, under this, having other criteria, not just letting everything hang on the test. And I think I applaud the mayor for attempting to try something different, because we just can't continue like this.
Could you just leave our audience with some suggested thoughts in terms of how they can better build those bridges, whether it be a neighbor or a community next door, in terms of understanding, in this case, the community?
I think there needs to be more opportunities for dialogue like we've had. Mm-hmm. we may come out on a different side of an issue, but I want people to know and to learn that when you listen, you should be listening to understand, not listening to anticipate a response or a rebuttal. We need to create more opportunities for the communities to come together in settings that make sense, whether it be a family night out for a particular geographic area, whether there be greater exchanges within the schools so that they have opportunities to work side by side. That's the kind of thing that happens. And in addition to that, more than anything else, the history of all of our peoples have to be represented in a way that truly illuminates the experiences of these folks, because it is only through empathy that we're going to be able to understand.
I'd like to say that one person can make a difference. We talked about Rosa Parks. She's one of those people. I go into the schools and I talk to young people. I'm not currently a teacher, but I talk to them about the civil rights movement. So each of us should examine ourselves and see where we can reach across communities and across groups. And then I wanted to say that we've done it in the past, we can do it again, because people came together across gender, across race, across class and ethnic background in the civil rights movement, and we got so many things done.
Well, I couldn't said it better. I just want to take this opportunity to, again, thank you both for coming, for sharing a very common history, our collective struggle for human rights. And certainly we want to continue this dialogue as we move forward. Again, I want to thank you, Dr. Bessie W. Blake, as well as Joyce Moy. Thank you very much. And we thank you in the audience.